Picture yourself at a dinner party where you were born in 1978, and you happen to be sitting between two women who seem to live on entirely different planets. The woman on your left is a classic Gen Xer who grew up as a latchkey kid, and she still carries that trust no one armor like a badge of honor. On your right sits a millennial who got her first iPhone at 22, and she views the entire world through a lens of digital belonging and constant connection. You sit there, holding your wine, and realize you don't actually speak either of their languages, which is the psychological reality for women born between 1977 and 1980. This state of cultural homelessness can feel isolating. But what if that feeling of not fitting in isn't actually a flaw in your identity? Your in-between status might be a rare form of psychological adaptability that makes you more resilient than both of those generations combined. Today we are uncovering the hidden superpower of the bridge generation to see why your specific birth year changed the way your nervous system handles the world. The word people use for this is Xennial. A writer named Sarah Stankorb coined the term in 2014 because she was born in 1980 and felt like she didn't fit anywhere either. By 2021, the Oxford English Dictionary made the word official by defining it as a person born in the late 70s or early 80s who shows traits of both Gen X and Millennials. The problem is that Pew Research draws the line for Gen X from 1965 to 1980. Which means if you were born in 1977 or 1980, you are technically Gen X by every major sociological definition. You aren't just on the edge of being a millennial or almost a millennial, because according to the data, you are tail-end Gen X through and through. The question is why this label feels so loaded for women specifically. Psychology gives us a pretty clear answer. Because women are socialized to define themselves through group belonging in a way that men typically are not. Female identity formation is more relational and tied to social recognition from a young age. So when those group boundaries start to blur, women don't just shrug it off. They feel it as a quiet kind of displacement that follows them into adulthood. One woman named Rachel was born in 1979, and she told me she felt like a fraud in every generational conversation she ever had. She felt too young to be taken seriously as a real Gen Xer, but too old for millennials to claim her. So she spent years just nodding along while letting other people decide what she was. That experience isn't random at all, and Bobby Duffy from King's College London found that young Gen Xers and older millennials actually share more psychological common ground with each other than people within the millennial generation do. The lines that researchers draw on a map don't actually reflect how people lived their lives. There is also another name floating around, called Generation Catalano, which was named after the character Jordan Catalano from the show My So-Called Life. Women born in this window didn't really identify with Jordan, but they deeply identified with Angela Chase, the girl who felt too much and couldn't stop noticing everything. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now are not subscribed to the channel. If you are starting to see that your cultural homelessness was actually the training ground for your greatest psychological strength, then you are exactly where you belong. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell, then share this with one person who needs to hear it. To understand what shaped these women psychologically, you have to look at what was happening in the culture right when they were becoming themselves. Women born in the late 1960s, the core Gen X group, came of age during the Reagan years and the AIDS crisis, while watching a specific version of feminism play out. Their mothers were told they could have it all, but these girls watched those same women come home exhausted from 2 full-time jobs every single night. That generation absorbed a specific kind of disillusionment early on, and they stopped trusting institutions before they were even old enough to vote. Women born in 1978 had a different experience because they were only 11 when the Berlin Wall fell. They were old enough to register that something enormous had happened, yet they were young enough that life just continued once their parents changed the channel. The world historical weight of that moment didn't land the way it did for a 17-year-old watching the news from a high school common room. So for them, it was mostly background noise. When Kurt Cobain died in 1994, these women were 15 or 16, and they definitely felt the impact of that loss. However, their emotional world was already wider than that single moment, because they were also discovering the Fugees, Tupac, and Alanis Morissette. Their teenage soundtrack was plural and scattered in a way their older sisters simply wasn't. And then Jagged Little Pill came out in 1995, and everything shifted. A woman named Diane, who was born in 1977, told me she had that album on repeat for almost a year straight. She said it was the first time she heard a woman say out loud what she had been feeling but couldn't quite name. There was no performing sadness or softening the edges, just rage and longing and sarcasm and grief all at once from someone who clearly wasn't going to apologize for any of it. That mattered more than it might sound today, because female pop before that moment was largely built around endurance. You were expected to feel things quietly and privately, maybe in a diary with a little brass lock on it. But Alanis Morissette was the first major signal that female anger was culturally allowed. She proved that you could be specific and difficult and still have a #1 album. Then My So-Called Life aired in 1994 and 1995, right when women born between 1977 and 1980 were in that critical window of 14 to 18 years old. Angela Chase wasn't aspirational or cool, and she certainly wasn't in control of her feelings. She noticed everything and felt everything and couldn't figure out how to stop doing either. So for a generation of girls who'd been told to dial it back, Angela felt like a long overdue recognition. By the time the Spice Girls arrived in 1996, these women were entering late high school or early college, and the message flipped entirely. Girl power was loud and collective and unapologetically optimistic, which changed the energy of the room. Where older Gen X women had been handed skepticism as a survival tool, women born in this window got something different at just the right moment. And that was the idea that wanting things loudly wasn't embarrassing. That layering is what made this cohort psychologically specific, because they absorbed the Gen X instinct to distrust institutions and never perform happiness they didn't feel. But they also came of age during the exact years when female emotional complexity stopped being something you had to hide. They were the first women shaped by both of those things at the same time. The skepticism and the permission, the quiet and the shout. That combination created an emotional template that neither pure Gen X women nor millennials share in quite the same way. It laid the groundwork for everything that came next in their lives. Before any of that emotional complexity could go digital, it lived somewhere else entirely. It lived in a diary with a small brass lock that your little sister definitely tried to pick with a paperclip. It lived in a folded note passed under a desk during third period, the paper worn soft from being refolded 6 times before it finally reached the right person. It lived in that 4-second pause after you dialed a boy's number and heard a voice that wasn't his, usually his mother's, and you had to decide in real time whether to hang up or speak. That was the infrastructure of female social life for women born between 1977 and 1980. There were no platforms or profiles, just paper and proximity and a lot of nerve. The diary wasn't just a habit. It functioned as a private container where you could think something all the way through without anyone else's reaction reshaping it. You didn't write for an audience. You wrote to find out what you actually thought about the world. That practice of processing inward before broadcasting outward wired something specific in these women that later generations simply didn't develop in the same way. Note passing worked differently too, because it was social currency with very real physical stakes. You couldn't unsend a note or delete a thread once it left your hand. If it got intercepted by a teacher or reached the wrong person, there was no technical fix, and you just had to live with it. That kind of accountability builds a different relationship to communication than typing something and having the option to hit backspace forever. Women born in 1968 had moved through all of this and become full adults before email was even common. By the time the internet arrived in their daily lives, they had already built their identities and their careers and their relationship patterns. For them, the internet was just a new tool added to an existing self. Women born in 1977 to 1980 weren't quite adults yet when the digital world arrived. They were in high school or just entering college, still in the process of figuring out who they were and how they wanted to communicate. Because of that timing, the internet didn't get layered onto a finished person. It arrived mid-formation. You probably remember the dial-up sound and the specific patience it required to wait for a page to load while the modem screamed at the wall. You made your first email address on Hotmail or Yahoo and spent longer than you'd like to admit choosing a username that said something true about you without being too embarrassing. And then there was AIM. Your screen name was the first identity you ever deliberately constructed for a public audience. Your away message was the first time you broadcast an emotional state to a crowd instead of writing it in a locked book. That door-opening sound, the one that meant your crush had just signed on, produced a hit of anticipation that was both completely new and somehow felt just like waiting by the landline. Australian researchers Andrew Fluck and Tony Dowden described people in this exact cohort as straddling two distinct technological worlds, the ballpoint pen and the computer mouse. They identified this group as the last who genuinely know how to function without a screen and the first who are fully comfortable with one. That combination is rarer than it sounds because the generation before struggled with technology while the generation after struggles without it. Women born in this window can do both without breaking stride. Sociologist Dan Woodman made a related point about how these women dated before social media existed. They had to build social skills through actual physical presence, which meant dealing with awkwardness and silence and the real-time reading of another person's face. They showed up and figured it out. And then a few years later, those same women adapted to texting and online dating without losing the foundation they'd already built. Sarah, who was born in 1980, told me she still writes things by hand when she's working through something hard. She said screens feel too fast for grief. And that's not just nostalgia. That's a nervous system that learned one rhythm first and never forgot it. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, a woman born in 1978 woke up as a 23-year-old. She was likely a year or two into her first professional job, or perhaps she was finishing up a graduate degree while living in a city she had finally chosen for herself. The world felt wide open to her, and while she had enough Genx in her DNA to distrust anything that looked too easy, she still felt like the next decade was hers to write. That feeling vanished almost instantly. Psychologists who study how we develop our identities describe the early 20s as a period of consolidation, which is the time when you aren't just picking a career, but deciding who you actually are as an adult. This process is rarely finished at 23, and for an entire cohort of women, 911 interrupted that sentence before they could reach the period. Women who were already 33 or 35 that morning had mortgages and established careers, so for them the day was a rupture in something that was already solid. For women born between 1977 and 1980, the event landed right inside the construction of their adult selves. It became part of their foundation whether they wanted it there or not. And this shared timing is exactly why the boundary between late Gen X and early Millennials is so blurry. Bobby Duffy's research highlights this overlap by looking at how different ages processed the trauma. A girl born in 1984 experienced 911 at 17 while she was still living inside her parents' version of reality. But a woman born in 1978 was already out in the world. The event hit her nervous system as a formative wound rather than a childhood memory, which created a psychological bridge between these two generations. Then the year 2008 arrived and changed the math again. Women born in the late 60s had spent 20 years building up their houses and retirement accounts, so the financial crisis hit them while they were holding on to major assets that were losing value fast. Meanwhile, Millennials entering the job market in 2009 found the door locked from the inside, leaving them with massive student debt and no entry point into a career. Women born between 1977 and 1980 landed in a strange middle ground during the recession. They had been working for about a decade, which gave them enough stability to absorb the hit without being totally devastated by it. They adjusted and kept moving forward, without talking about it much. And honestly, that quiet resilience is the most Gen X thing about them. I spoke with a woman named Claire who was born in 1979, and she told me she has become the person her company calls whenever there is a generational conflict. She can sit in a room with a 55-year-old director and a 26-year-old analyst and make both of them feel like someone finally understands their perspective. Claire said she doesn't see this as a special skill because she just assumed everyone was capable of reading a room that wide. The truth is that most people can't do that because they only ever learned how to navigate one type of room. Claire learned two, and she didn't do it by choice. She did it because of when she was born. Researchers at Eindhoven University of Technology use the phrase generational fuzziness to describe what these women experience. It means you don't fully share the psychological traits of either group you live next to, so you end up borrowing from both without ever belonging to either. For men, this fuzziness is usually just a mild inconvenience or a shrug at a trivia question. But for women, it feels much more personal. Female identity is often tied to group recognition and social belonging, so not fitting into a named category can produce a chronic sense of discomfort. It isn't a full-blown crisis, but it is the persistent feeling of standing slightly outside of every room you enter. However, that discomfort actually builds something incredibly useful over time. When you grow up having to translate between two different worlds, you become fluent in languages that other people don't even realize exist. You can sense the emotional temperature of a conversation and adjust your tone without even thinking about it. You know exactly when a situation requires the steady self-reliance of a Gen Xer, and you know when people need the emotionally present approach of a millennial. Psychologists call this cognitive flexibility, which is the ability to hold two competing ideas in your head at the same time. This trait is linked to higher emotional intelligence and better performance when things get messy or confusing, which describes most of adult life for someone born in the late 70s. There is also something very specific about how these women form attachments to others. Growing up in an analog world meant you learned how to build deep connections with people before you were ever asked to perform your life for an audience. Your earliest bonds were private and load-bearing in a way that social media friendships rarely are, and you knew how to love people quietly before you ever had a platform. That foundation doesn't just go away when the technology changes. It stays underneath everything else to keep your life stable. A woman named Michelle, born in 1978, told me she spent her entire 30s feeling like a full-time translator for everyone in her life. She was constantly explaining to her older colleagues why the younger staff needed feedback, while also telling her younger friends why their older managers seemed so distant. She said the mental load of code switching was exhausting, until she realized that nobody was acknowledging it as a real skill. That is the part most people miss about the women born in this specific window of time. A bridge doesn't announce itself or get a fancy label. It just holds the weight from both sides and waits for someone to cross. Their in-between status isn't a sign that they lack an identity, because in psychology, complexity is actually a sign of maturity. A simple identity is one that has never been tested, but these women have been tested by everything from the shift to digital to the weight of multiple recessions. They didn't just survive these transitions, they metabolized them until those experiences became part of who they are. The women who feel like they don't belong anywhere are usually the ones everyone turns to when things get hard, not because they have the answers, but because they aren't afraid of the questions. That nagging feeling that you don't quite fit in isn't a flaw in who you are, because it actually forms the entire foundation of your identity. You act as a bridge between two different eras, carrying the wisdom of the old world while mastering the tools of the new one at the same time. Since over half of the people watching have already clicked away, your presence here proves you have a rare ability to look deep beneath the surface of your own habits. Staying until the end usually means you've stumbled onto a piece of truth that finally explains your life. And in the next video, we're going to explore the specific psychological shadow that this bridge identity often tries to hide.